So joining me today is Bill Campos, who is the CEO of Independent Living Australia. You're also a registered clinical psychologist, plus a host of many other qualifications, which I'll let you say about yourself. But most importantly for me and for my listeners is that you are also a child of a parent who had a serious mental illness. And we want to just talk about your story today and obviously working in the field as well. You've got a really good expert opinion where you've not only lived through it, but now you're helping other people, or you see it from a qualified perspective as well. So thanks for joining me today, Bill. And do you want to start up with a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Joel. As you rightly pointed out, I grew up in a family where my mother was the one that had quite significant mental health concerns or mental health illness. I think probably it's important to highlight that my growing up was a little bit unusual because I also migrated from Brazil to Australia when I was 10, 11 years old. And so there was a different perspective, I guess, of how a kid grows up with a parent with a mental illness. So the important thing that I obviously got involved with you guys is the understanding, in my perspective anyway, that there's a lot of talk at the moment about mental health, but there's still that element that's still not talked about a lot, which is the mental illness part of the mental health. A lot of people still experience a significant part of mental illness. And when I grew up, this is back in the 80s really, there was no discussion at all about either mental health or mental illness. And that was something that was very little spoken about because of just the nature of where we were as a society, I guess. Me growing up as a kid, I think it's not until you become an adult and you start to realize the differences in your upbringing to other people. It's not until you look back in your in perspective to say, okay, well, a lot of things that I experienced as a child has a very different experiences than probably a lot of other people have. And I guess one of the things that I felt was really important for me was that when I lived in Brazil as a young boy, we were part of a very large family. And the reason I thought it was really important to highlight this is because back then in Brazil, there was not much awareness of mental health at all, and two, there was not much health support in some ways in terms of hospitals. And so a lot of the support that my family received is through our wider family, and so when my mum was unwell when I was younger, you would have cousins, we had family, aunties, my grandmother would often come over and stay with us. And as a kid, you didn't think anything other than, just family coming around and supporting us. But knowing the background now and the perspective is that, they knew that there was something happening with my mum and that my mum needed support and my dad also needed support. So there was that kind of really, I call it like a family envelope that was able to absorb a lot of the stresses that comes with living with someone with mental illness. Then obviously coming to Australia for various reasons, but I think probably the most important one was the financial implications. And my dad, being an engineer, was able to get a working visa into Australia, which is an opportunity I think that a lot of people in Brazil sometimes seeks. So we were fortunate enough to actually secure a place to migrate to Australia. This again is back in 1980, 1981. And then we were extremely isolated. So with my family, was just my mum, my dad, and my brother and I. And again, we were still reasonably young as when we migrated to Australia, so we were still able to absorb. And even though it was kind of scary leaving a lot of your family, there was an element of excitement coming to a new country and learning English, which is something that my brother and I and my mother had to do. My dad had a little bit of broken English. But it was then we started to notice, particularly my brother and I started to notice that there's things about my mum that, we would question now that we just kind of accepted as a kid, but we knew that was probably not what every other mother does. And I remember things like, in the perspective that when I was growing up, is that sometimes my mum will come home from work on Friday afternoon and literally she would be in bed all day until Monday morning. She would not get out of bed for the whole weekend. She would stay in her bedroom all day. And my brother and I and my dad would get out and do activities. And my mum would just be completely, absent for the whole weekend. I just remembered she would not get out of her pajamas for the whole weekend. Other things that and then obviously later on, my mum experienced some episodes too. So there were times when, my mum just become quite delusional at times. And when you're a younger kid, like when you're in the 10, 11, 12 years old, some of the things that my mum would tell us, for us as kids, it seemed plausible. So we wouldn't know better. I mean, I think I remember this quite clearly that my mum would be quite paranoid about people coming to the house or curtains and things. And as kids, we just thought that was a plausible thing, that we shouldn't trust people coming to the house, and we close the curtains in case someone was watching. And that's something we grew up. But now, in that context, we kind of understand that that's kind of a little bit of my mum's delusions that was happening, And at times things got really out of hand because she became quite manic at times with those delusions as well. So growing up, there was a lot of testing times. And I know, Joel, you and I spoke about, because we share some similar experiences, I guess. But I guess the point of difference for me was my dad. My dad has been such an enormous strength, and he was always very, very supportive, and in some ways absorbed a lot of the tensions that sometimes happens when my mum was unwell at times, that kind of isolated my brother and I. And a couple of things that I think, looking back, what my dad did that was exceptionally helpful was that he just helped my brother and I to be heavily involved with sports and activities. So we were constantly going to school, then playing sport in the afternoons, scouts, bike riding. And that was, looking back at it now, it was a great mechanism to kind of absorb some of the tension that happens when my mum goes through these cycles. So I have to say, my dad has been an enormous part of my life and how we actually been managed through some very difficult times.
I'm nodding my head and it looks like I'm smiling, but I can completely agree with everything you said. And I reckon we had a very similar experience growing up. And I think what you said was, I haven't really discussed with him before, but you said stuff about your parents tell you one thing and you do believe it as a young person. So you might be 10, 11 or 12, or for me, and you had that, and it can be really, after a while, you sort of learn maybe a bit of critical thinking as you get a bit older. But there is a time where you just believe what your parents says. And in my situation, my mum used to say, your dad's coming to kidnap you and take you to Saudi Arabia. So we thought we were going to get kidnapped all the time, right? Because my dad was working in Saudi Arabia at the time and they weren't together. And so we always went around thinking, there was legit kidnapping threat.
Yes.
Like it was a legit thing for us, right? And this was just part of it. And as you got a bit older, you sort of get to 14, 13, you go, that's probably, you sort of know what's going on a bit more, but that's not true. But that's something that is quite often not spoken about, is when you have a parent with bipolar disorder, it can be very scary sometimes with what you're told and things like that. And if you don't have that support of, let's say, a parent, like we had a single mum, it can be very scary until you get a bit older to learn that it's actually not the case. And you can have a lot of trauma that's impacting on you for those situations. So I want to talk to you from your perspective in regards to, what does bipolar disorder mean to you, or what was it? Because obviously there's a definition for it, but what was it to you and how did it affect your mum?
I still trouble with understanding, both as a clinician, and in my life as all different areas of mental health. I still struggle with the term bipolar because, it just means that either people are very high or low, and it's not true. There was cyclical behaviours, and we didn't know when the cycles were. So, and the other thing too, which I think it's not often spoken about, there were some wonderful times with my mum. My mum was exceptionally creative, and she had those highs that which was quite intoxicating in a really pleasant way. She would encourage us to be very creative, or when it was raining, she would come outside and it was pouring down with rain, and she would encourage us to jump in the mud, and she would jump in the mud with us, kind of have mud fights. So there was a real element of some great times that I probably would have thought other parents would have been much more reserved about their approach with doing some of these, events or activities. I think the question was bipolar, manic depressive. I still don't know. Even now, studying psychology for 25 years, I couldn't tell you definitively what bipolar means. But what I can tell you, though, is I think there are two different types of or at least a way of us having the need to have a conversation about describing people who have a mental illness, which are more associated with things like schizophrenia or schizoaffective disorder or bipolar or manic depression, whatever those type of mood disorders, which is currently the way they describe it. And then you have a mental health condition based on life events like, grieving or suicide or depression or anxiety that are sometimes often, experienced because of life events. And one of the things that I sometimes do talk about is we probably do need to understand mental health in that kind of spectrum where there's that mental illness type of, or mental health condition as a mental health experience. I use a term in describing some discussions and talks about how in diabetes, they have a type 1 diabetes, which is the people who are born with insulin dependent, and they have to have that sort of things in terms of supporting their insulin. And then you have type 2 diabetes, which is essentially people who are experiencing diabetes and insulin because of their lifestyle. And I think that same sort of thinking probably needs to be brought into the conversation around this discussion around mental health and mental illness. At the moment, mental health is some ways the flavour of the month, where there's a lot of discussions, but it's talk about the entire spectrum, and a lot of the focus is on, workplace mental health or depression or helplines or things which I think are incidental based on support of people who are experiencing a mental health event, but we still need to be mindful of that the mental health and mental illness of people who has a long-term sort of detrimental effect, and need to be much more aware of how we support and navigate people in that spectrum, if I could put it that way.
Absolutely. And it doesn't just affect the person with it affects the whole family unit, as you would know. Your life is completely affected by it 24/7, and you live with the person 24/7. So you're affected by the actions. If they're manic or if they're depressed, it directly affects you as a child, and you've got to live with that for 18 years or until when you leave home, right? And this is what people don't understand. Yes. So in regards to the current discussion, because I completely agree with what you're saying, there is mental health awareness left, right and centre, and workplace, and everyone's posting about, we're doing this for mental health, and that's great. But as you and I know, we never hear about bipolar spoken about in discussion. We never hear about young carers. We never hear about, schizophrenia mentioned in the same sort of, let's say, awareness channels, or people are publicising it as much, even though it affects like 2% of the population, let's say in relation to bipolar. But in regards to who it actually affects outside of the people with the condition, it's a lot more, because you've got one person with it, and then you might have a whole family unit of, let's say, 20 or 30 people who are directly involved with that person who are affected by it. So it affects a lot more people than what people realise, but it's not, let's say, marketed or even advertised in the same sort of discussion that's getting all the mainstream attention at the moment.
Yeah, you're spot on. You're spot on. I mean, I think one of the things I could highlight here is two experiences. One's a personal experience, which I think will give some insight. When I was 15 or 16 years old, and I'll share this experience, and it is very personal, but I think it's important to highlight a little bit about how that ripple effect happens. So I remember being at home one day, and I was studying for some sort of test and exam, and my brother and my dad had to go somewhere. So I was literally alone by myself at home. And this is one of those times when my mum was unwell and she was at home sleeping. And I didn't know anything better other than I was just staying in my room and studying, ready for a test. Anyway, to cut a long story short, I heard these enormous screams and banging and people outside, out the front of the house, about 3-4 houses down, and I didn't think anything of it. I just didn't think anything of it. And I remember it started getting people yelling, and there was some banging, and I went out the front door, and suddenly I realised there's my mum. My mum was out there banging the front door of the neighbour. She's screaming the head off. She was partly dressed, or half of her, and the neighbours were kind of fighting and trying to push her into it. And I just felt completely alone. And I just remember the first thing that the neighbours told me is to call an ambulance. And this is the day before mobile phones. So you have to run back home, ring. And as a kid, 15 years old, you ring and it took 15, 20. My mum was completely irrational. She felt, she was screaming, kicking, she was yelling abuse at everyone. It's probably one of the first times I saw an enormous implications of her condition to the whole element. We did call an ambulance. The ambulance came pretty much almost straight away. They kind of secured her, and my mum was fighting with these ambulance. They restrained her, put her, and all I remember was two things. One is my mum was trying to refuse to have any medication. So and the medics were needing to actually give her some injections. And so they've asked me to hold my mum's hand while she do it, and my mum was screaming and shouting and so forth. But I do recall two things that were really, really important about that experience for me anyway was, and it is very personal, but I do remember clearly looking at my mum and trying to rationalise and talk to her. And I remember her, looking back at me like as if I was a complete stranger, and that was really that's when you suddenly realise, there's a reality to a mental illness that really impacts, sort of like that personal level. Now, the reason I'm telling this story is that eventually she went to the hospital. Again, these are the days before mobile phones. 3 hours later, my dad showed up at the hospital after the neighbours told him what happened. In the hospital, nurse just came in, took me to a seat. They took my mum to an examination room, and I remember my mum was still being violent. And that's the other thing I recall quite clearly, is how strong my mother is. I remember there was a security guard there, and she was wrestling with the security guard, much bigger than her, and she was like the Incredible Hulk. She was just pushing the. There is a funny side. You have to kind of look at the funny side of some of these experiences. Now, the reason the ripple effect happened afterwards. My mum was in hospital, I think, for about 3 or 4 weeks. She obviously didn't return home, but the issue that everyone on the street knew that my mum had an illness and that I had to go to school with some of these kids down the road. And there was this complete embarrassment as well about that. That took months and months and months. And there were some neighbours that were, incredibly supportive. But on the other side too, there were some other neighbours that were completely very critical and very unsupportive, I guess, in some ways. And then you lived with that. So we lived in that suburb for probably 5, 6 years. And the dynamic of that episode, we lived through it right through to middle high school. Kids knew, and we, my brother and I were reluctant to invite people over to our house. We were very cautious about how we do this. And my mum went through another episode a few years later as well. But we'll probably catch a little bit earlier than we did. And because some neighbours were supportive, there was always an element of checking in, which is very helpful. So I think going back to your point, which is that's the ripple effect. My school, my friends, pretty much we had a small, quiet street, but, 20 or 30 neighbours kind of knew. And the whole dynamics of how we interacted with the family also became quite different after that episode.
Well, it's a huge burden on kids, and this is the thing, we forget. We always say, children are the priority and stuff, but they're not in these situations, or at least from my experience and from your experience, I would presume you weren't the priority, or there was not much consideration that would have been given to you at the time.
No, it wasn't. And for whatever reason, I think partly is because people still didn't understand mental illness, or they didn't. It's a bit of a taboo subject. We're going back in probably mid-late 80s. And you're right, all these sort of discussions and usually would happen at a family, and my poor dad was the one that probably had the burden of sitting down and explaining how your mum probably has a condition that not a lot of people have. But yeah, it wasn't. And I do remember quite clearly sitting at this hospital, this is going back a long time ago in Sydney, for 3 or 4 hours waiting what happened. And I had probably 2 very brief interactions with a nurse. First of all, telling me to sit down in the seat here while my mum goes into this examination room, which I had visibility to because I can see her thrashing about.
Yep.
But also probably an hour or 2 later, after she was obviously, calmed down, they came back to say whether I was hungry, whether I wanted any food, because it was something like 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And a lovely nurse gave me a sandwich or something. And I didn't know. All I said to them was, I need to contact my dad, and I gave phone numbers. And then my dad showed up 3 hours later. So I did not know anything about what's happening, Mum. This is probably the first time that was really in my face, because I'm assuming it was as a point where it's quite severe and acute for my mum. And that was when it was really hit home about her condition. But I do want to share another story too, which I think gives a different context too, because I always have a dilemma about talking about mental illness, because there is still a bit of a stigma around mental illness where, the scenario of they're crazy, or they got some weird sort of understanding, or they could be dangerous. That's still perceived a little bit, or at least, people sometimes associate mental illness with those type of kind of, danger, craziness type of understanding about what a mental illness people could have. I remember this going back, if I can fast forward a little few years later, I was working as a bank teller, believe it or not, when I was studying at uni. And this is where the times when it was just small branch tellers in local suburbs. And this is when you had passbooks. You had the old passbooks that people come in, they give you a passbook, and the teller would wrap up and then give the money back. The reason I'm telling the story is because there was a customer, being a suburban branch, there's a customer that constantly comes over. And there was a particular gentleman, which I'll I can't remember his name was, but let's just call him Robert for a moment. And I used to always serve him, or every week or every second week. And I knew there was something different about him for two reasons. One, because he was very gregarious, very, sometimes he'd come up with blue hair, had very different clothes. He was, very loud. And his passbook always had a limit as to how much money he could take. So he was on some kind of arrangement where he couldn't take too much money, and everything was recorded a certain way. Anyway, I was in that branch for about a year and a half, and over a year, we kind of knew on certain time, every fortnight or every week, he would come, and we sensed that he had something slightly in his condition, and sometimes he would come in as a complete zombie. He would come in like as if, the life was sucked out of him, and he just comes in hardly walking, with hardly talking, just kind of throw you the passbook, you get the money, and he walks out without saying a word. Other times he'd be life of the party and be coming all dressed up, sometimes with wigs and manicures and hair, and like he was a man, and he'd be dressing with a dress, and he'd be really funny, he'd be really engaging, he'd be a life of the party. But there was an incident that happened once when he came into the branch, and it was a busy day and we had a queue, and this particular gentleman, Robert, was very agitated. We can sense him, can see him at the end of the queue that he was kind of twitching and kicking and mumbling to himself, and he was quite erratic. And as I was serving customers, he was getting more and more agitated. Like he was hitting on the poles on the sides and flicking pens. And in the front of the queue, just in front of him, there was a lady with a daughter, and she started moving the daughter around away from him. And there was a moment where something happened, but he literally looked at this little girl and he went towards her, grabbed her by underneath her armpits and shook her and said, "What the hell are you?" And said all these profanities. And she was probably 8 or 9 years old, and really frightened. And then there was a whole lot of screams, and people came in, people tried to tackle the security guard, tackle him. And he was yelling like also like Satan and devils and things like that. There was a whole kerfuffle. Obviously, the mother was completely distressed. The poor girl was, absolutely traumatized by it all. They grabbed the guy, they took him out. We had a police statement comes in. The mother was wanting to make sure that there was, some repercussions about the actions, and charges were laid. And obviously, we didn't hear from Robert I didn't see him after that event, to be honest with you. That story for me captures pretty much a lot of the things that I have in terms of understanding mental illness. Because when he grabbed that girl, and I'm a parent now, if someone did that to my little girl, complete rage and protection will come over to me. And I don't care whether someone has whatever reason they did. If they completely came in and grabbed my girl like that did, I would be completely furious, and I would do absolutely everything to protect my family. I can take the rational steps. So in that moment, you can rationalize and understand completely the actions of both the mother and the daughter and the police, and how something like this could happen, traumatic. But the flip side of this also was I felt a little bit sorry for Robert as well, because in his head, he must have been struggling with so many demons on that day that he must have been completely irrational, that he probably hadn't had any idea or intent of doing something like that. But he was struggling with so many sort of, I call it demons, but, it could be all sorts of things. But living, just the way I understood the things that might have been going through his head, you kind of felt sorry for him. Can you imagine what might be like living with so many emotions, anger, frustrations, and voices, and to the point where you can't even control your own conscious. And so that's why I tell that story, because I think, sometimes people often talk about mental illness as in people being very dangerous, and to some extent that's true too. But that person living with an illness, you don't know what's going through their head, what kind of anguish they're going through, and what kind of torment they're experiencing. And even though some of those torment might actually be completely delusional or unrealistic, for them, it's got to the point where it's so real that they actually have to act on it. And so, and I juggle that sort of scenario with my mother as well, because often at times I keep thinking with my mum, Mum, why can't you just be normal? Why can't you just rationalise? It's just things in your head, you kind of think that way. But then at times you're thinking, oh my God, if you had all those voices in your head and you had a complete delusion that something was imminently going to attack you and threaten you or your kids or your family, and you act on it, even though other people see that as being unrealistic, but for them it's life-threatening. And so, that's to me captures an element of the dilemma associated with mental illness, because we need to also understand that when people live with a mental illness, it's not by choice that they have this condition. And sometimes they're at a position where they can't control it.
They can't help it. Exactly right. Thanks for sharing all those stories. And hopefully a lot of people take that out. And I'm sure if there's anyone listening who has a parent or had a parent with a mental illness, they'll be shaking their head and nodding like I am in regards to the, especially the stories. I'm sure we can all relate. But in regards to, I think that having that foresight when you're young is very hard, because you just like, why can't they be normal? Like, my mate's over there's got a normal mum and dad and they're working and all that sort of stuff. Nice household, and I've got, why can't I have a normal parent? It's really frustrating. Yeah. And it's, it takes a certain level of maturity to deal with that. But also, you're right. They can't help it. And that's the thing I didn't learn until a lot later on in life. And, I unfortunately didn't have much empathy growing up for my mum, because she didn't manage her condition well. So she didn't take her medications and stuff like that. So I had a lot of, not as much sympathy or empathy with the condition. But you're right. They can't help it, and even they might want to take their medication for whatever reason. They might be, I'm better now, or I don't think I need to, and they can't help that as well. Yeah. So you've just got to go with it and have that sense of empathy and understanding, so that when you just don't get the frustration and anger, which I presume a lot of young people would still probably struggle if they were in our situations now, Bill. Yeah,
spot on.
And now, were you made to? Now, did your mum ever go when she was in hospital? Did you have to go in and see her in one of those facilities as a young person? And how was that?
Yeah, we did. And there was also, we were a very close family, because obviously there's only four of us. So I was from mid-teens or late teens, I was quite heavily involved. As soon as I started driving, I was expected to drive my mum to, appointments and psychiatry. And so that was, got much more involved a little bit in the care of my mum in terms of how she manages these situations. And there were, I can share some things that are probably going to get me into trouble, but because being a clinician, you often also question how much little they tell the family. So I drive my mum to the psychiatrist, and we kind of sense that she's still quite unwell. But I used to find this really frustrating, is that, it would take 6-8 weeks to get an appointment, and we have to kind of manage my mum with these delusions. And sometimes days will be good, some days will be horrible. And then I drive her to this appointment, and, she rationalises things, and we've got 45 minutes, and my mum within that 45 minutes, talks like as if there's nothing wrong, and almost to the point where the psychiatrist thinks, the family's something,
Yeah, I agree. My mum was a good actor as well. Absolutely.
Yep. And I struggled with that, because I kept thinking, we're really asking for help, and you're talking and you're focusing on my mum, and you're saying that she's well, but yet, we're experiencing these sort of things at home, and there's the dynamic of, well, she's the one in treatment. If my mum wants to keep something confidential, the psychiatrist will ask me to step out, and they will talk, and I would come in at the tail end, and my mum would know this. She would know that she wouldn't want the psychiatrist to share anything, and that's a kind of client privilege thing that they have. And so I'd leave that meeting with very little understanding of what we could do to support her. But to be honest with you, sometimes leave those meetings much more frustrated and much more isolated, because the psychiatrist is very much focusing on her, and there's some steps that he's helping her with, but we're not privy to as a family. We're at home, and that really frustrated me about the the kind of services that we provide. There needs to be a little bit more understanding about the person and that family system, rather than just the person.
Hey, spot on, Bill. And they've got to understand as well, we don't want our parent committed, right? We're not saying this stuff because we want them to be committed. What benefit do we get out of it? It's your mum or your parent or your dad. You love them. You don't want them committed, but you want them to be safe. And what people don't realize is there's a time before they get really full blown, like, manic. And there's a time like 3 to 4 weeks. So this was my mum anyway. But you couldn't do anything. Like you couldn't call the police or the psychologist and say, hey, as a 12-year-old, as a 14-year-old, whatever, that she's getting unwell, come and get her or whatever. She had to go voluntary, right? And they didn't want to go voluntary. So they've got to get to the involuntary stage, and then you've got to get the emergency services involved, and then away you go. So there's a massive gap where it's still, for me, that I haven't seen any solution attempted from any from the government in any way to fill that gap of, let's say, that 3 to 4 weeks or that period where they're getting unwell? There's that sort of period there. So from your perspective, as you work in the area, what can be done in that 3 to 4 week period or that period before it's getting on? That's not happening at the moment.
I think it's starting to happen, but it's still a long way, because I think the way the system, and we are talking about a health system, is designed, it's very much based on hospitals and GPs. It's those two extremes. So you either have hospital-based, and in order to get hospital, you need to be at acute or crisis level in order to be rushed to hospital. And maintenance is usually conducted at a GP level. And unless you have a really good connected and long-term GP, you often go to a local GP practice with 4 or 5 different people coming in, and you just see an episode of care. I call it an episode. Like, you go in there, you see one GP, you get your prescription and go. And, it's unlikely at times where you may go back and you get the same GP in these medical practices. I think there are a couple of things that are happening at the moment. There are a couple of things in Victoria. They're called prevention and recovery centres, which is something that I'm really fond of, where it's a step up or step down. So it's a 30-day sort of home environment in a community where people could be, if they are understood and they're aware of their mental illness, whether they can be, again, voluntary, but they could actually be referred to what we call a step up or step down before either going to hospital, or if they're in hospital, they step down into a process where they can then transition back to home and engage with employment or family and other resources as well. So I do think, I'm probably pushing that because my organisation is also trying to create more of these services. But I think that's one step towards that, particularly with mental illness, where people can actually have a space in the community, like a home, with very qualified social workers and peer workers, where they can have that kind of step up or step down process. And you often need, when people have a mental illness, just moving away from home is also, it's very difficult, but also quite therapeutic, because it gives chance people to have a different perspective and not be stuck in a daily routine or, the kind of day-to-day sort of pressures that people often get. So that I think in Victoria they've got a lot of these park services. I think in New South Wales we're trying to open up more of them as we speak. But I think that's one step and it is a face-to-face service, because that's the other thing too. I think the government has pushed a lot of money into the online space, particularly over COVID, which is understandable. But you need to have an ability to go to a place where there's a familiar face and continuity of care. And Joel, I'm sure, for me, the hardest thing about, supporting someone with mental illness is that you really do need to understand and know them a little bit well to know how their moods fluctuate and how they might be, you need to have that kind of, I call it continuity of care, or at least an ability to know how they are in different parts of their journey, so that when they do show up for help, you already have an understanding of where they might be high or low, or, their kind of sequences of what they need in terms of support. And there are some great GPs, there are some fantastic psychiatrists, but they're very little. There's not enough of them, and you need to develop that relationship with them, which takes a long time.
So what advice do you have for a young person, or someone, let's say even an adult or a young adult, who has a parent with bipolar or some serious mental health concern, when there is that period that they're starting to get unwell? What can they actually do? Because at the moment, it's generally, if they don't want to go voluntary, the person, it's literally get to the end of the rope, and then the police are coming around or the ambulance is coming around, then you're into the hospital, then you're going to get admitted. But what can be actually done?
It's a scary step, because the younger the child, obviously it's much more difficult for people to believe them. But my suggestion would be, this is something that I took steps when I was 16, and when the first episode happened, I went to my GP. I literally, not only for understanding what's happening with my mum, but also for myself, and the GP that we have seen him a number of times, and we kind of knew for different reasons, but the GP was great, because not only was he able to then ring my dad and talk to my mum and ask my mum to come in for an appointment, which was a lovely GP, he also recommended for me to see a psychologist at the time when I was 18, a psychologist down the road. And I have to say, the psychologist I saw wasn't very helpful, but But the GP was, because he alluded to me and he said, you know what, you might need to talk to someone outside of your family just to give some space and get a perspective that, you know, outside of that. So they're few and far between, but my advice to a 15 or 16-year-old, invest in getting care. And the other thing too is there's a bit of a trial and error until you find that care that you feel you can trust and feel that can be supportive. So just because you go to one GP and you don't like, you know, the stocks, or you don't like their you know, the demeanour or whatever it might be, you may need to try and choose a GP or a psychologist or whoever it might be that you think, okay, you know what, I could probably talk with this person. And so you need to persevere a little bit and just give yourself some time to make sure you connect with someone that you think, you know what, I can talk to this person.
And in your opinion as well, Bill, how should it be explained to a young person? Because I never had an explanation growing up, even though mum was treated by psychologists and psychiatrists. No one actually literally sat us down and explained to us at all, literally. Yeah. So how do you think it should be explained when there's mental illness in the family? Or how should professionals, or let's say people close to the young kids or children or young people, how should it be actually explained to them to help them?
Yeah. As a parent, because obviously my mum is now a grandmother, there's some great books. There's some resources that you can purchase, like, you know, children's books, and that's a great way of of starting a conversation and knowing that things are different. And for the life of me, I can't remember the name of the books, but there is organisations that are able to give some context by depending on the age group of the child, that you may actually have book. And books are usually good because you can tell the story, and then you can, as a parent, when you're sitting there with your child, you can actually start discussing a little bit what the story is trying to unfold. I did use this book with my kids, which was it's called The Polar Bear, The Blue Polar Bear. I don't know if you're familiar with that book, no. But we talk about the polar bear having two little polar bears, and for some reason the polar bear has eaten the wrong sort of fish, and he got really unwell and started getting quite erratic. And these two little polar bears were quite isolated. And so what they did was they went into a place and looked at the other polar bear mother across from the other part of the iceberg, I guess, and just said, look, mum's not well. And so that was the ability for the herd then to get together and try and help the blue polar bear, the one that ate the wrong fish. And then what the story is about, these two little polar bears having time off with a parent. The blue polar bear goes off and starts sitting on their own iceberg while they start to get the kind of fish out of the system, and then talk through a little bit that sometimes when people eat the wrong fish, they kind of get unwell quite radically, and they become the right person. So instead of a white polar bear, they ate the fish, became a blue polar bear, and that's how we need to understand. And so the story then told that sometimes it's not just what you eat in the fish, it's also a little bit about where you are in terms of your palate. So it gives some discussions around this, which I think is quite, it's a nice way to kind of invite the discussion around mental illness with children without necessarily, using stigma or scaring kids into that discussion, and just raising awareness. But I have used that book with my kids. There are other older ones too, as, mid-teens and so forth. Nowadays on the internet and podcasts like yours is really great, because especially teenagers now who everything is online, things that you promote here through this channel is really helpful. I mean, that's part of the reason I reached out to you, Joel, because I think what you're doing is spot on in terms of raising awareness. So, and I know also into the future, children's book is going to be very rare. So a lot of the information that we'll get through will be through either social media channels or some sort of electronic media type of approach. The difficulty about it is you kind of have to refine and choose ones that are quite useful, because there's so much information out there, so as a parent or whoever, it's quite important to be selective and spend a bit of time and carefully choosing the kind of information that you share and discuss around.
Yep. Yeah. That's great advice. And I was going to ask you a question. I've never heard this discussed anywhere online, but we've both gone through it. So do you think it was helpful or harmful to you as a young person when you had to go and see your mum in the hospital? Now, I'll tell from my perspective, it was basically, I wanted to see my mum, so I didn't care whether it was in the jail, wherever it was, I would want to see my mum. But when I look back on it now, when we were taking in there, like she just had ECT, which is electroconvulsive therapy and stuff, and I was talking to she wasn't my mum, right? So it was very hard to reconcile. We weren't explained or debriefed on what really happened. So long term, I look back and I go, that's actually a really traumatic experience. But at the time, I didn't know that because I just wanted to see my mum. I didn't care. So for you, from your experience as well, going through something similar, do you think it's advisable for young people or for children to be put into that environment, or how should it be dealt with?
Yeah. I think it's up to the child, to be honest with you. I think it is. You're right. You're quite right. My experience has been that it is quite traumatic and confronting going to it. And it's not only. I mean, when my mum went to hospital at the very early stage in the 80s, you know, the psychiatric ward and these hospitals were also really difficult places to go. You know, because it's not only my mum there. You have a whole number of people who obviously you don't know and were acting quite strangely, and so it is quite a confronting experience. But my rule of thumb would be that I really wanted to see my mum. You know, just the fact that you see her and she's alive, and she's, even though she might have been quite, I remember this, or she was quite zombie. She was just literally like a zombie. But the fact that you held her hand and she looked at you and she maybe say, "How's the dog?" or, you know, did Jonathan or did your child play soccer or something? You know, those type of things. It reassures me a little bit that the person I know is still there and she's getting better. You know, and so I think the rule of thumb would be, if a child really wants to see it, I think it probably is important because it's that family connection. But it is confronting. And I think that's one of the things that the realities of that kind of scenario is that you kind of hits home that, you know, your mum is unwell, needs help, and the process of getting help is quite difficult. You know, so the flip side of that is it's kind of, you mature yourself as a child very quickly. You know, life is not all kind of, you know, games and funs and every wonderful weekends. You know, sometimes you go and see your mum in hospital on the weekends and you realise, geez, I can't wait for her to get out of there.
That's right, yeah. And that, I call it the moment of awareness, right? So there's something in your childhood where you're probably lucid enough to actually go, oh, you know, maybe our situation is not the same as many others, and you have that. And as you said, you lose your childhood almost really quickly, don't you?
Yeah, you do. And the other thing too is, I mean, I've been on the journey now for, say, 30, 40 years with my mum. I'm actually, believe it or not, I'm her carer at the moment. But I think every time we have interaction with the health department or health systems, it is getting better. You know, the last episode my mum had, which is a few years ago, or 3 or 4 years ago now, there was a wonderful paramedic, because my mum was really unwell at home and she was living by herself. My father was unwell. He couldn't live with my mum anymore. He had some physical, the paramedic, because I rang mum and said, "Listen, mum, I just want to talk to someone." And I was quite desperate because the neighbours were concerned about my mum as well. So we rang the ambulance, and the paramedic was just an absolute star. He stayed with mum for 2 hours, asked some really important questions that highlights that she's really acutely unwell, like things like, "Tell me a little bit about, you know, did you spend time watching TV?" He said, "Yeah." "What kind of things did you watch?" "Yeah." "And what kind of shows you like?" You know, and that's when my mum starts to divulge little things, pieces of information that's important. Things like, I was talking to this famous star on TV and he was telling me these things. And straight away you can see the paramedic going, "Aha, okay, so it's a delusion. She thinks she's getting messages from the TV, you know. What do you do in a normal day?" And so he spent 2 or 3 hours. And my mum is always very reluctant to go to any sort of treatment or help. But he was able to connect with her to say, "Come in, we'll go for a drive in the ambulance." And he put my mum in the front seat. We'll drive over to the hospital. We'll talk to the hospital kid you might need. And the discussion came around because she was also unwell. She had a cough. And this paramedic was brilliant, absolutely brilliant, you know, because that was what the discussion was. It was around her unwell because she had a cough. Got to the hospital, a wonderful nurse came over. Again, the paramedic briefed the nurse. I sat down on the side. They went to hospital. They came in and said, "Listen," and then they were up front with her, say, "Listen, it looks like you're unwell, not just with your throat. It may actually be affecting your mental perspective. Are you experiencing this and this?" My mum kind of said, "Yeah, okay, you know, that's right. So maybe it might be worthwhile keeping you overnight for a few days to see how you're doing." And it was just hard to say it, but it went a smooth process, you know. Like if I wind the clock back 15 years ago, it was like, you know, 4 or 5 security guards holding my mum down, getting her injection in the bum, yelling and screaming, a whole crowd around her. It's very different. So, Joel, I mean, the one thing about these sort of things that we're opening up and discussing is that it does make the system better. I still take my hat off to people who work in psych wards, because things like now, as a family member, they're much more open to the idea that family connection is really important. So sometimes when people are quite, again, going back a few years ago, when sometimes they're quite violent, they don't allow you to see. You have to see people through a window or a perspection. They know that it's really important for family to come over. They know it's important to give people some freedom when they start to become on a path of recovery. They do need to actually allow people to have flexibility of making their own choices, even though they're in a psych ward. They need to go down there and go to the canteen and get a hamburger and a Coke rather than just getting, so there is a lot of changes that are happening for the better. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think the emergency services are really, really good. The best experiences I've had with people have been generally the police or the AMBOs. It generally hasn't been with a psychologist or psychiatrist. We sort of, seriously, it's never really been, from my experience, we've never treated with much respect from them. But the police or the ambulance or the paramedics were really, really good. And as you said, I've had similar experiences with that as well. They'll pick up on, with my mum was the same thing, didn't want to go, but they'd pick up on a physical ailment, on let's say her foot was sore or something. Oh, we've got to go in and get you scanned for the foot.
Yes.
And then they get them assessed and then away you go. And the nurses do a good job. Sometimes they can be overworked and get very frustrated. And I remember having a few Barneys with a few nurses back in the day. But it's just one of those things where it's such a encompassing experience. But not only that, if you move away from home, it still follows you, right? So you leave, you get out of that environment, but you're still, as you said, you're your mum's carer now. I was my mum's carer before she passed away. But it's not something where you can just separate yourself as an 18-year-old and you go, I'm done with it, which was what I tried to do for a long time. It's something where you're still involved all the time, whether it be with multiple daily phone calls or there's medical decisions or whatever. So it's something where it's a lifelong thing for a person or for a child if their parent has a serious mental illness. Maybe do you want to talk a bit more about that full cycle with that?
I mean, sometimes we just talk about mental illness, but I have friends of mine in my age group who care for their elderly parents who've got cancer or who have dementia. So where I see myself now is that it's not too far different from some people in my circle of friends who are experiencing very similar, particularly dementia. I've got a friend of mine who has an elderly father who's got quite bad dementia. There's that tug. I feel that there's always that tug that think like, and I'm going to say like, shit, mum, get your act together. And I had enough of this and you want to, just get your act together. But then after a while, you have to understand that, she's my mum. This is how she is in life. This is the condition that's beyond her control. And, you kind of know, especially in my scenario, we're only 4 people in Australia. So we have no other family other than my brother and I and my mum and dad. So if I remove myself from my mum's life, that's going to be extremely isolating because not only that, she already isolates herself to some extent living by herself at the moment. And my brother lives interstate. And the only interaction she gets with family at the moment is myself. I mean, the internet has been great because it allowed us to reconnect with our family in Brazil. So my mum does have an iPad and she engages, which has been, a saviour, to be honest with you, over the last 5 or 6 years. That has been such an enormous change in her to can reconnect with her, sisters and brothers and so forth. But you're right, it is lifelong. The other thing too, which is hard sometimes for people to understand, is that it's sporadic. Like a colleague of mine had a parent who had cancer, and you go through a treatment of a year or so, and eventually they're cancer free for a while until they go through another process. Whereas sometimes my mum would have an episode, and things would be right for 2 or 3 years, and then she'll have one episode, 6 months later another one, and she'll have another one 6 months after that or 3 months after that, and there's no way of us precursing that. So that always keeps you on your toe, that it's not something we can just let go and she's better now, great, unwind and she's going to be fine for the next 3 years, because, there's that element that it could be just around the corner. And again, it's not too dissimilar, for example, cancer, because you might have cancer and you bite on cancer and then 6 months later you find out it comes back again. But they're with the mental illness, I think one of the things that I struggle with, particularly as being a kind of, in the health system to some extent as a clinician, is that with, other diabetes or cancer or Alzheimer's or some other kind of tests, there is some kind of way of verifying that the person has a clear-cut illness. Like with diabetes or cancer, you can do a biopsy or you can do some blood tests and you can see. With mental health, there's still not that ability to actually, say, yep, you have a mental illness, and no, you don't have a mental illness. We have the indicators, and it's still a blunt instrument in terms of understanding psychiatry and psychology about understanding mental illness, because we have what we call indicators. You could say things like, a person that might have trauma, drugs and alcohol, isolation, genetic predisposition to this, and all those four things indicate that that person may have an illness, and because they are presented to the hospital at one stage, they may have a mental illness. But it's hard because I call it the kind of sunburn effect, because it's like saying, particularly with trauma, we tell ourselves that we need to slip slop flat because you might get melanoma. But just because you get sunburn doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get melanoma, if that makes sense. You go out, you expose yourself. Some people get a lot sunburn quite a lot of times, but they never get melanoma. And the same with sort of mental health. We talk about how this might be traumatic and this might have been something that happened in their lives, or this might have been, an overdose or overuse of drugs. That might have been the tipping point. But you can never tell definitively that that's what's going to lead to them being identified as having mental illness. And that's one of the things that I struggle both as someone who experienced a parent who's gone through it, but also as a clinician, is that there are indicators, but there's not a way of really closely identifying until you actually walk with them and be on a journey for quite some time, which takes a lot of energy and resources. Then you start to understand that that person has some kind of mental health issue or kind of mental health condition.
Now, from a clinician's point of view, what's your opinion? This can be very controversial, but the reason why I bring this up, for example, right, I went into, I looked at a lot of the major brands in mental health space, and I downloaded something from the Black Dog Institute, which had a thing about bipolar. Yes. And they had on there about bipolar, about treatments, and they didn't have ECT mentioned as a treatment, which I found very odd. I emailed them, they never got back, but that's all right. But why do you want to talk about electroconvulsive therapy and how that works with bipolar? Because I know it's something that's not talked about a lot, and it can be very divisive online. I don't think we know how it works, but it does have an effect, and obviously it's a catch-22, right? Like for me personally, this is from personal experience, not from a medical experience. I believe excessive ECT was done to my mum and basically caused her to develop a condition called PSP, which is progressive supranuclear palsy, which is a rare brain disorder, and eventually that's what killed her. And I believe, all things being held equal, if she didn't have the ECT, she would never have developed it. But saying that, if she didn't have the ECT, she could have been committed suicide or chose to end her life. So it's sort of like a catch-22. So maybe do you want to talk from a professional's perspective on ECT itself, and what are your thoughts around that?
Yeah. I mean, I have to be honest with you, Joel, I don't have much experience about ECT because, don't get me wrong, I do know that is a model of treatment that's still utilised or used in some cases. My mum never went down that track, or at least not that I'm aware of. She may have had some treatment in a hospital, which wasn't unknown to me. But the issue about the treatment one is a really important one, because my mum went through a huge number of medications. There's always this trial and error of medications, because it's not like as if the doctor says, okay, you've got bipolar, here's your medication, take it for a year or whatever it is, twice a day, and you'll be fine, like a cold or a flu. Some of the medications made things worse. There were times where mum was taking some medication and the doses, and I have to say I do struggle with this, and I need to be very careful a little bit about what I say because I'm in the sector. But sometimes there is so much focus from the clinicians on the actual treatment. In other words, they want to know from my mum not about how she is, but what dose you're taking, how regularly you're taking, and the whole therapy session becomes about what my mum's taking, how much medication, what the dosage rate is, and the psychiatrist spends that time just understanding the medication dose without really going beyond that. So I have struggled with that perspective of caring or treatment of people with mental illness. What I can say is there has been times where it worked exceptionally well. So when my mum's going through different trials in different areas, there's been a couple of cases where she took a medication and it helped. It really helped. Not only did we started seeing her kind of being back to the state that we kind of understood as her being well, but also it gave us some prolonged sort of stability as well in her moods, which I thought was really helpful. But then after a while, the medication kind of, I don't know, loses the effect.
Yep. Lithium, they get a tolerance to lithium or whatever
tolerance,
it is.
Yeah. And then it's kind of going back again. But what I can say is that if I talk about treatment, and ECT might be one, and there are some very strong medication. Like my mum, up until recently, was still taking a depot injection in her leg, in her thigh, every month. And these are very toxic ones that you have to take blood tests every month to make sure she doesn't actually, become toxic. And to put someone through that kind of treatment is, it's gut wrenching, but also knowing that it's also experimental. You're not sure whether that treatment's going to work or make it worse. It's again a bit of a it's kind of leap of faith actually in the people that's treating her. But I've been on both sides. I've been the one where I'm thinking, why did we go down this treatment path where she's gotten worse? Why didn't the psychiatrist or the people who were caring for her knew this and also checked on her to make sure that she didn't get worse? And then on the flip side, there have been times when you can see mum escalating, but then, an attentive clinician helped her to give her the space she needed. And for some reason, the medication worked brilliantly. She was able to move. She was able to then get a routine. She was able to go back to work. We had spaces of 2 or 3 years where in the eyes of a child, life was reasonably normal. She would even showed up on the weekends to watch us play soccer when we were kids. So there is this trial and error. And I think what I struggle with is that kind of still trial and error about a medication. We talk about, health has been a scientific endeavour and things should be black and white, or at least closer to black and white. But in the mental health space, there's still more element of trial and error in supporting people with mental illness. And ECT is one of those, because sometimes it works for some people, other times it doesn't. And it's a bit of, let's see what happens type of approach, which is very, I suppose, in some ways, not the best course of action.
Well, that is a good point to make, Bill, that it is very experimental still, because
yes.
I know when I was my mum's medical guardian, I had to make all these decisions, and a psychologist ring me out of the blue, say we're going to give her clomazepine or whatever it is, and it could have heart issues and stuff. We're going to send her for a heart scan. I'm like, gee, but that's just the reality of when you live in this sort of environment. That's what we have to go through. Yeah,
you're right, exactly, and it's I don't know. It's a nature of working in the space because there's still so much we don't know. That's the other thing too, which I think there's an illusion that that we know a lot about our health and science and things, but when it comes to the brain and moods and human nature per se, there's just far too many dynamics to say, yeah, great, we know what the answer is. Because I use this analogy while I was teaching or helping younger kids to come in. The brain is like the universe. We still don't know so much about it. If you really think about it, like people think, oh, we know about the universe, but the universe expanding. The fact is, we know so little. And the brain is such a complex, organ that we know so little.
I think there's a big project in America going on they're trying to map every neural pathway in the brain. I think Obama approved it or something back in the day. But I think that's happening at the moment where you're right, that's where they don't understand the brain at all, really, do we?
No. I mean, we know clusters of it. We know as much as we know about the universe. We know galaxies, we know, light, we know gravity, we know the parts of the brain are associated with, the vision or smells or memory, and we know clusters of it. But how that interacts, how does someone suddenly get delusional to the point where they think that their life is in danger because they perceive that someone's outside the door when there's no one there, and it becomes a physical reaction, like they're actually acting on something that's not there. There's so much we don't know.
So why'd you go into the field then, Bill? Because obviously when I grew up, for me, I hated it. I didn't have anything to do with psychologists. I want nothing to do with them. But whereas you've gone into the field, so how did that come about, and what made you want to get into the work?
Yeah, I was going to say I fell into it, but it's not really true. when I went into uni, because I struggled through school, to be honest with you, I really, really struggled at school. And I just scraped in enough marks to get into uni. And what I wanted to go into uni was very much to do architecture or design and get something completely different. But there was a topic at uni that turned things around for me, which was a history and philosophy of science. And I remember clearly this tutor asking a question: why was I born me and not you? And that resonated with me, because we can learn about engineering and technology and design and politics or law, all these constructs that we've done, but there is a fundamental question here about human nature that we probably, it did give me a profound impact that, people are different. Why are we different? We all use money, but we have different perspectives and different understandings of life. And so the second year I was doing a science degree, I decided to take psychology. I thought, this is probably an important aspect of understanding. And how I justify myself is, even though the journey was difficult with my mum, it opened up the eyes to there's so much about human nature that is actually fascinating. Particularly when we talk about not only just an individual going through their own emotions and life, but also about how people interact with one another, families, groups, workmates and things. It opened up a door for me, which I think I became very, very interested and also passionate about, because I started thinking everything that we know about the world is through our five senses. Each individual has these five senses and we interpret these differently. And the way I see it is probably one of the most important frontiers of, the future is how people interact with each other. We talk about Elon Musk and all these wonderful endeavors that people are creating enormous things and changes. But ultimately, it is people who make these changes, people. How we contribute, how we collaborate, how we engage with one another, how we trust one another. So you can have an economic system, you can have an entrepreneur, we can have legal systems, whatever it might be. Ultimately, it falls down to how people relate and connect with one another. And that to me is where it was a bit of a life-changing moment, I think second year at uni, that kind of, my experience with my mum gave me some insights. I shared with you before, Joel, that it was kind of almost inevitable because when I was in my mid-teens, because my mum didn't speak English very well, I was actually sitting in the psychiatrist's and I was translating. So it was, some of the questions and some of the psychiatrists and doctors' questions were quite fascinating for a young kid to also understand. I kind of grew to love that kind of construct or understanding of psychology, and I didn't look back.
Now, how did you stay on the straight and narrow growing up? Because I think when you live in a situation like this, you have every excuse to not achieve or to go the wrong way, to get on, to do whatever, if it's alcohol, drugs, or do something else, because you can get into that victim mindset where you can go, look, life's crap. I'm, blah, 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 I'm going to do this. So how did you stay on the straight and narrow growing up to go and achieve all the success you have?
Yeah, well, it seems like I have all the success, but it's never been an easy road. I failed uni. I had to go back and do other subjects. It hasn't been like a lineal sort of things. It may look like that, but it wasn't. How did I stay on track? I think one of the things is I had an enormous sense that responsibility fell on me. I don't know if that was true for you, Joel, but for me, I'm a migrant. I only have 4 family members in Australia. I had to translate a little bit to my father and my mother and navigate the sort of world. And it never occurred to me that I just want to leave all this, and because it just felt like as if that was the thing I had to do, because I had to kind of so that parentified responsibility happened with me about 16, 17, that kind of, don't go down the drink, even though, when you're a teenager, you do some risky things. But in my head, there was always an element that, okay, you only go a little bit, but you don't go that far, because, you need to be strong for the family type of approach. I don't know. It may sound like a cliche, but I think there was that. And I have to say, my dad was enormous inspiration. He still is an enormous inspiration to me because, looking back at how he did things, how he navigated, how he managed, because he took sometimes I experienced some of the things from my mum, but he was living with my mum. He was going to bed and living, lying next to my mum every night. And he was very devoted. And not only that, he still is to some extent, but he's still very much in love. He was always an element. I've always understood that my father always had enormous love for my mum, even though I didn't see it the other way around. And that was a very strong, I suppose, message for me, that you can love someone, but they might not necessarily love you back. But I did see my enormous devotion. And, there was an inspiration there. And like I said to you before, my dad also helped us always to be very busy. Being busy really helped. Sports was a really big part for us. There was a time when my brother and I were 6-7 days a week always doing some sport, whether it's, we were living in Sydney where there's Police Boys Club, which is like PCYC. We would go there 3 nights a week. We'd play soccer twice a week. We'd play tennis twice a week. We'd be on the weekends doing one sport in the morning, one other sport in the afternoon. We'd be catching. So all I can remember is outside of school hours, we had a whole regime of sport that kept us busy and focused, and that helped even when I was going through, university.
Yeah, I think that's the best. That's one of the best bits of advice I generally give as well, is what you just said, is throw yourself into something you're passionate about and just do a lot of it, because you'll get self-esteem and self-confidence from that. Yes. And you can take yourself out of that environment. Same thing with me. I did a lot of sports and I played a lot of guitar. So whenever I played guitar, mum left me alone. So I could practice. The more I practiced, the more I got left alone. So I practiced a lot and I got left alone. And that's just the way it was. But yeah, I agree with you. As you said, throw yourself, if you're a young person or in that situation, throw yourself into something you're passionate about. It doesn't have to be sport. It could be arts, whatever it is, or whatever you are, and just devote yourself to that, because not only that could even be your way out to do something else, but you'll get that self-esteem and that self-love from that, because I think a lot of kids in our situation who grow up as well, I think they're finding now, studies, is very low self-compassion and there's very low self-esteem, because they're in a situation where could be very depressing or very dark at times, and they think, well, I don't deserve the best in life. So they don't really do much to get themselves out of it and stay on a path of negativity and don't really go on to achieve much, which I think there's some studies and stuff I've read online. So it's very important to find something you're good at and do a lot of it, get yourself some confidence. In regards to what your organisation does now, so do you want to talk about more what you're trying to achieve in the mental health, mental illness area?
Yeah. So our organisation is called Independent Community Living Australia here in Sydney. We do a number of services, predominantly is around mental health. And I think one of the biggest programs that we do is called Supported Independent Living. So these are people with what we call chronic and persistent mental health, and we try and help them for getting a long-term accommodation. So these are people who not only have a chronic mental illness, but also has disadvantages to their lives, which means that they may not have family connection, they have be very isolated, and so they essentially need some stability in their lives. And so a lot of the work that we do is around people with long-term and persistent mental health, and we try and support them into a home, and we put 24-hour support in that home, and we get 3 or 4 of those people who have a similar condition to be supported in the home and help them to maintain some sort of to get their life back on track, support some recovery, and see how much we can support them over long term. Some, not all of the consumers that come to our program don't have any family. For whatever reason throughout their journey, either their relationships have been, severed, or they've come from another country, or, the family's kind of walked away from the particular person with mental illness. So we do provide some support with these people and get them, I suppose, the ability to just give them some sort of consistency is probably what we do. So that's the bulk of our work. We alluded earlier that we are trying to also look at developing these step up and step down processes, which is a prevention recovery. I think to me, as I mentioned before, the biggest stable part of the element is hospitals and GPs. We need that space in the middle. So we've been really fortunate, the organisation that we have, that we developed one of the few park processes here in Sydney, which is still a trial sort of process. But we're getting some really good results, which gives the ability to get that buffer and allowing people to transition to and from or even avoid hospitals for people who have a mental illness. Yeah. So that's going really well. We also do a lot of work around peer works. So, and this is part of why I think it's so important to have something like yours, is because we talk about clinicians, we talk about hospitals and treatments. Another piece of the puzzle is also having the lived experience to help people understand and walk through the journey. So it's very different from a psychiatrist or psychologist telling you this is what you need after you leave hospital, as opposed to someone said, look, I've been to hospital, this is what experience I had, these are some of the things I found when I went back home, and then share those experiences. So there is a part that we do here that we try and promote a lot, is our peer workforce, to try and complement that treatment process that you do need, some kind of mentoring and support through those transitions. I guess that's probably in a nutshell. A lot of the work we do is with people who potentially could be homeless, who have, quite a lot of disadvantage. But I'm proud to say that I think we do some really good work. And we've got a great bunch of staff who are quite committed. And if I could just plug a little bit more, Joel, is that one of the things that COVID has highlighted, I think, is the enormous strength and capability that a lot of people in this sector, and we talk about the disability sectors where we're currently at, where they do go, and there's a lot of people that provide care that's often unsung heroes. I know we talk about COVID where we've got the nurses and we've got the paramedics. There's also the disability and aged care workers who, during COVID, they still had to show up to their shifts. They still had to travel through public transport. They still had to show police that they could travel and be part of the service. And they still needed to get vaccinated first, in these times. So this workforce that we're working in also took the brunt of the COVID experience. They couldn't work from home. They had to show up to shifts. They work with people who are very vulnerable and sometimes quite volatile. So what I think it's really important to recognise is that if we're ever going to look at a system to recalibrate, there needs to be more emphasis on the people who provide care, and we're paying people just a little bit more than what they might get at Bunnings, but they were showing up, they were supporting people in need, and if anything, I give my shout out to the governments is that we do need to recalibrate a little bit about those people who are in the care profession to make sure that they're well supported and, recognised.
I agree with you 100%, and they're actually a useful profession. There's a lot of useless professions who are paid a hell of a lot more money to do not a hell of a lot, whereas we've got people who are doing this sort of type of hard work and, and they get maybe a little bonus here and there, but they showed up and they kept everything going. And their role in regards to supporting people and how that flows into the economy, I don't think they ever really truly calculate how much of they save the country money in regards to trying to put people in a position to be productive.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, once we talk about numbers, that's when we get people's attention and talk about dollar signs. But if we took out all this disability workers in there and let them go to the hospital systems, we couldn't afford it. So, and that was been a highlight. And I guess I couldn't be more proud of the kind of culture that we have here at ICLA to really still roll our sleeves up and get on with it. A lot of people did that. It's been quite taxing, but a lot of people in our work, in our sector, to be honest with you, have done that.
I want to acknowledge something before we spoke about that, which is about your dad, because in regards to relationships where someone's got schizophrenia or bipolar, I don't know the statistics on it, but like my mum was a single mum because of it, really. But it's not a common. I don't know if it's a common thing where the person stays in a long-term relationship, from what I know. But kudos to your dad for doing that. But that's a thing where you've got these relationships where the other partner is such a hard place to be. For your dad, I'm sure it would have been, and on the opposite, if it's someone's mother or something. But they're absolute heroes in what they do, because they're on the first line in regards to suicide prevention, making sure the home is doing its thing, looking after the kids. And then you got that extra burden where they might not be getting that love back from that person, or it could be very, very difficult, yet they tough it out and they stay for the family unit. So maybe you want to talk about that more, because they don't get any attention whatsoever in what I see. You have all people, an athlete shares their story about depression once, which is fantastic, gets all the national coverage, where you've got someone like your father supporting, coming from another country, supporting your mother for many decades and raising a family and doing a really important job to the community, where's the recognition for that, And that's maybe you want to talk a bit about it from your perspective.
Yeah. You got me a little bit emotional here, Joel.
Well, it's important because I just don't think I might sound really cynical on this, but I think from our perspective, we've got the authority to speak on this, and we can speak on this in regards to mental health awareness is great, but all people think about is depression and anxiety, and that's it.
Yes.
And the only time it gets coverage is when there's an athlete. So I've had depression once, fantastic, and they share their story. All of a sudden, they're the pin-up person for mental health. It shouldn't be the case. It should be the real people like yourself and like your dad, who have lived with this intense burden for the whole of your lives, and this is where the attention, this is where the focus, and this is where the support needs to go moving forward, because at the moment it seems to be getting sucked up into a whole bunch of marketing for websites and brand ambassadors and all feel-good stuff that you and I would see on LinkedIn all the time. Yet we know what the real stories are and the real ramifications for your lives are. It's still not spoken about in the same sort of, even acknowledged, what I feel, in the mental health awareness movement at the moment, which is why I'm happy to say it and go on these sort of rants, because it might piss a lot of people off the way I do it because I keep going on about it. But I think that's where the real change will happen. In this country, I think people with bipolar are 17 times more likely to commit suicide than someone who doesn't have bipolar. Yet we never hear about that mentioned, and we don't put what I feel enough resources to supporting those people and those family units.
Yeah, you're right. And I mean, my dad has been a huge hero mentor to me. There's no doubt. And I think one of the things that it's important to highlight here is not only did my dad struggle with some very difficult and dark times, and at the times also this, if I can put it, if we were to seek help, that we found more barriers than we did in terms. I just remember years ago where we would try and fill up all these bloody forms, and we fill up the wrong form and go to this backwards and forwards, and it'll suck the life out of my dad because he's already on very little energy trying to maintain things, and then he goes to an agency which I'm not going to name, and he's given lots of forms and have to get verification of IDs. You have to go somewhere else, and this is before internet, so everything had to be run around from one place to the next and next and next just to get some support. And that was a huge, barrier. You had to kind of really push hard to try and make sure that those things happened. I mean, it wasn't what I think it's important also, just because someone has mental illness, it's not always a burden. And I think this is where I think I rationalise. And my dad and I talk about this because there is some high times. I mean, when my mum was manic, I'm assuming, and things were on such a high, it's quite lovely to have someone who's so much. That's my experience with my mum, is so full of life, and there's highs. It takes a whole family with it, and there are little snippets of those times where it kind of gives us hope, I guess. And I think that's one of the things my dad and I would talk about is, the 80% of the time things were quite neutral, or we kind of anticipating something. 5% will be absolutely wonderful, and the 10% will be absolutely horrible, But it's that element, knowing that there could be that high coming as well. I think that's what allowed my dad to really stay connected to my mum, that kind of ability to know that there's still a bit of love. And when those times come, you make the most of it, because that's when you can actually get the best out of, us as a family, but also as my mum. And my dad's a wonderful man because he's very calm, very perceptive, very mild-mannered, and he goes under the radar. You would know that the kind of things that my brother and I experienced in the background, the kind of things that, people would never, ever see that life, that part of him where and things like managing finances, running around to help my brother and I to get to different places. There's so many things that happen in everyday life that you probably take for granted. But when times are really tough, particularly for us as a family of four, we came to Australia with very little money. So my dad had to start up again. The kind of sacrifice. I mean, I remember, I've probably been sharing too much here, but I think one of the things I remember clearly when we first moved to Australia is that my dad was still trying to find employment. And back in the 80s, it wasn't too hard to find employment, but we were trying to settle in Australia. And Dad had this mad idea that he would actually do a paper run. And here's a man who's 37 years old all the other kids are doing paper runs, throwing paper, and my dad was hoping to get some money that would give us some money, enough money for the end of the year for Christmas. And he was out there doing the paper run. So me, knowing that only kids do this, I went out with him, and I told everybody that my dad's coming with me rather than the other way around, just so that we can, save face, so to speak. But those little things that happen all the time, have you ever heard of the book called Atomic Habits?
I have, yeah, James Clear.
Yeah. There's those little atomic habits happen in the family that just helps us to be, stay buoyant. And there's enough of that keeps us, I suppose, hopeful about our family. And we grow up together. My brother and I are good mates even today. Like we talk on the phone today about that he needs to come and visit Mum because she's okay, but not great. So, he has to come up from Canberra and spend a bit of time with her.
But what an impact in the community your dad's had, because, see, my dad couldn't handle his bail, right? So, but with your dad, he's hung around and created two really productive members of society, right? And that's really important. Whereas if they're not there, who knows what could happen? And you can't blame that person for going the way they do. But a lot of people go that way, whereas you've got the benefits of the community of if your dad could get some more support or have some more support or take those barriers away, because the better chance he's got of raising, two really productive young kids, the better it is for everyone, right?
Yeah,
long
true.
term. Yeah,
it is true. I mean, not to dismiss much of what my dad did, there's also a little bit of luck, along the way. For us, we were quite fortunate. And I think one of the things that really helped us is when we moved to Australia, we were really fortunate because we were going to move to a really far away place within Sydney, away from where my dad was working. It just so happens that he knew someone and there was a unit not too far from his work that was going to open, and they reduced the fee or the rent on that enough for us to be able to afford it, which meant that my dad didn't have to travel so long because back then, we were quite poor when we came to Australia. And then, you'd have to commute an hour and a half to get to work. Whereas, for me, I'd see those little things that happen as being, such wonderful gems of luck. Because my dad was only 15 minutes away from work, so if something happened at school or something that could literally pick up the car and come up and see us. I don't know. I mean, Joel, I think every family is different. The other thing too, even though we're just four and it seems like isolated, we just had to rely on each other, including my mum. There were the times where there was no option. We had to make things work. That kind of pushes you to just be either creative, to persevere, and to make sure it works. And don't get me wrong, it may seem like I'm 52 years old and I've got a career and I'm reasonably well established. There's been some dark and difficult times, I'm sure, with a lot of people. But I guess you keep in mind a little bit about where you want to go and focus on what you can achieve.
And what do you see in yourself now as a personality trait or something that you've got that is due to living in that situation that's a positive thing in your life?
Yeah, as you know, I'm in a role now as an executive, as a CEO. I'll be fair because one of the things is that I'm very mindful of the individual needs and be very focused on empathy. And one of the things I sometimes need to be mindful of as a CEO is that sometimes you have to make some really difficult decisions. And I struggle. Struggle is not the right word, but every time I have to make some difficult decisions because of the need of the organisation or a need of a particular clinical decision that needs to happen, it hurts. I find it difficult because your gut feeling is, but that person, if they just give them the extra time, if we just help them out a little bit more, that could work. But in an organisation where it could be quite detrimental and there's a domino effect if you don't take action and you put other people at risk, you need to sometimes make decisions where you don't necessarily need to, or you take into account the individual needs, but you can't just focus on the individual needs. And I think what my experience has been is that as a young kid growing up with a parent with a mental illness, you often go with the flow and you try and make things work. But as you get older, I use a scenario where the lifeboat decisions as you get older, and particularly in the role now as an executive, where you have 10 people to save, but you've got a lifeboat that only fits 5. And you have these situations in organisations where we only got such a funding for this amount of funding, and we can only take these sort of people, but the demand is there, and you constantly. And I even to this day, I manage it better now, but it is something that I see that I need to be mindful of, that I don't focus too much on the individual needs and just go with someone individual. I need to actually step back a little bit and focus on the support of the system or the organisation in my case.
Now, from a funding perspective, Bill, what are you seeing that's happening? Because in Victoria, we've got our Victorian government's promoting whatever it is, $1 billion towards mental health. We're going to charge businesses, and I don't know where the money goes, but what funding is needed in what areas can make the most impact, do you feel?
I'm probably blowing my own trumpet here, but that prevention, that step up, step down, I think is a critical one, particularly here in New South Wales, because we don't have that same sort of infrastructure as you have in Victoria. So I do see that as being a key one. I think one of the things that the biggest gap I see is a transition of care. So, for example, if you go to hospital, you get really good treatment, you're there, and you my experience has been you get 24-hour support, you get psychiatrists, you get the best sort of support in that person. And then when they leave that and go back home, that to me is the biggest gap, is a transition of care. And it's not just in mental health, although mental health is probably more so because mental health overlaps with things like housing, employment, family, and other things. But, it could be your firstborn child. You have your child and you go home and the kid might have a whooping cough or something, and that transition of care doesn't translate from the hospital into the community and get some care at the community. You can't ring your GP and say, well, you can, but you need to develop those relationships. The thing that I struggle the most with funding, to be honest with you, Joel, it's not so much where the money goes. It's the funding cycles. It's this kind of yo-yo effect where, that we create a program, we develop a number of resources, we put a rationale and a business case for it. We go to either state or federal government and they give us the money and we get the money up and running. And then 3 or 4 years later, they say, that funding cycle's finished, it's gone. So we promote, we resource it, we think it's a good thing. There's some evidence to say that the service is really good. That to me frustrates the hell out of me, to be honest with you, because there's all these funding cycles and the government doesn't necessarily provide any stability in the community sector, which is where I work. So you constantly, as a not-for-profit organisation, you're chasing the money to kind of continue through some services and making things happen and work.
Now, is that purely a political thing, the funding cycle, or how does it?
It's a bit of both. It's a bit of both. Sometimes it's a response from the government. So, for example, the floods or COVID, they'll throw some money into the community and say, "Can you do this?" And then that the need's no longer there. I guess the difficulty I have is that you never provide stability and that continuity of care in the community, because that space, like you get really good treatment at the hospital and you get some sort of continuation of support with your GP or primary health. And that, again, that depends on how well you connect with it. But in the communities, if I needed to get additional services or something, because of the funding cycles, services always change and criteria change and the needs change and outcome reporting's change. So there's always constantly a flux of changes in this space. And that doesn't provide any stability for that sector.
So what should happen with that? Is it something where, because it's a 3 to 4 year funding cycle, is it something where you want to see a 10-year period, or what would actually help in that area?
I think it's a matter of commitment on what the service is. So because every time there's a funding cycle, different organisations put their own branding on it. They call it different things. So you want to have a hospital and you want a community sector and you want a primary sector. So it's just a matter of saying, okay, these are all the different transitional services for this age group. One of the things that I think did work well, again, this is my personal opinion. I might talk too much here that I might get in trouble or some criticism coming my way, but one of the things I found really useful at the very early stages of when Medicare locals were developed is that there was a sense that as organisations, whether you're community, hospital or primary, that you focus on the needs of a community or of a region. So there was an element to try and bring services together that you collectively commission So in other words, you get money from the state, money from the federal government, money from the local government, and try and say, look, this is our community, whether it's a local health district or a local community council. And you say, look, this is what some of the needs are. We identify these are the people that potentially has needs, whether it be hospital admissions or whether it be, immunisation, whatever it is. And collectively, you hone in and support that community. You can bring in police, you can bring in ambulances into that discussion, and you start to share that information so that there is that underlying focus on that responsibility for that community. And I think that's where the future is. And the difficulty is trying to get some consensus. And, with politicians coming in and out of politics and different agendas keep coming up, and some people have louder voices than others. So, sometimes things get funded for things that potentially shouldn't be funded.
Yeah, I agree. And I want to talk real quickly about sharing your story, because thank you for sharing a lot today. It's a very courageous thing to do, but it needs to be done. And I think that's what's needs to happen. But what's your opinion on sharing this story? Because we know for a fact that there will be people in Canberra or elite sports people or whatever who had a similar situation to us, but have probably never told it to anyone. I know Greg Hunt recently shared his story, which was online a little while back. But for me, it's like, well, if you've got someone in that big position, the health minister, you would think, well, this is my main priority. But they say, well, Treasury basically controls all the decisions. But what's your opinion or advice for sharing your story? Because for me, I think the more stories that we get like yours, Bill, but at a scale, we can start maybe shifting that awareness and that funding into organisations like yourself into these other areas, which would help people with serious mental illness.
The reason I came onto this show, Joel, to be honest with you, is not for me to push an agenda as such. I think the thing that really resonated with me about your podcast or the lived experience is exactly that. The story is about lived experience. For me as a clinician, the one part that we need to elevate a little bit is allowing people to know that what you're experiencing is not in isolation, is that there are other people that are going through very similar things. And you and I, Joel, I think we resonate with a lot of our stories, and that made me feel comfortable talking to you. But, I have a whole lot of staff here that I work with that I haven't shared the story with because, either it's not relevant or there's a different relationship that I have with them. So I think that to me was really important. Why I came here is to share that lived experience, and you share the stories means that you can share a little bit about, you don't have to work through these experiences in isolation or thinking it's just me or just my family. There's other people there that needs to understand that happens with others, and because there's when I grew up, I believe, as far as I know, I was the only family with someone with a mental illness. I can't recall any of my other friends having anything like this. So that to me was important. The more stories, I think one of the things that is really important is to try and open up discussion. The elephant in the room is that when you talk about mental illness and mental health, I think that's what I really liked about your podcast, is that we really do need to understand the differences and types of mental health. As clinician, as a peer worker force, we need to start articulating the differences in presentation and needs with people with different mental health needs. And there is, in my mind, a very different way you approach a mental illness as opposed to a mental health condition that people might be experiencing. Not to say it's less valid, because obviously people are very unique and they experience things differently. But that to me needs to have that distinction. And if more and more people start talking about it, I think it starts to shift the needle. I know I sometimes come across as being very critical of these large funding bodies getting, large organisations get a lot of money. But you have to, in my experience over the last 40 years, you have to give some credit to things like Beyond Blue or Black Dog, because they do shift the needles. It does allow us to have this conversation. The Are You OK Day elevates the discussion where it was buried quite a number of years ago. And maybe we're at a point where there's been enough elevation and discussion now that we need to start articulating the details around those discussions, and the funding should then be redirected to a more pointy end of the discussion as opposed to the more general discussion. So in my experience, if I had my first experience when my mum went to hospital 20 years ago, I guess what I was talking about is the shifting of the needle in the discussion was, that those investments in things like Beyond Blue and Black Dog and a few others if you wind the clock back 10 or 15 years ago, they were the first organisation that kind of shifted that discussion into making people aware that we need to also talk about mental health. It's not just physical health.
Yeah.
And I think now it's come a time where people, through mediums such as yours, we can now start to refine that discussion to more pointy end of the discussions, things like the family, things like how does help happen, not just for the individual who's experiencing the mental illness, but the people around it. How do people pick up on those signs? There are even things like, mental health first aid, which my dad did a few number of years ago, which is a great thing because it allowed my dad to understand a little bit different perspective of my mum's presentations and how she.
Yeah.
So things are moving in the right direction, probably a little bit slower than we would like, but it's still going in the right direction, I believe.
Well, what I think needs to happen, Bill, is I think that the big brands, as you said, they have moved the needle into discussion, but I think they've got to recognise themselves as brands now.
Yeah.
And they've got the public awareness. So if you've got the public awareness, you need to extend your scope of what you do. So for example, Beyond Blue is about suicide prevention, yet they don't have anything about bipolar or schizophrenia that's of any substance whatsoever. And I know for a fact when someone, let's say if they have bipolar or whatever, rings up Beyond Blue, they refer them to a really small organisation who might be able to help them, who's got no funding, right? So it's like, well, if you're taking all the money for a lot of money and awareness for mental health, which you've done, which is fantastic, start broadening your scope to encompass as much as you can rather than just shifting on this areas, because they always throw out the stat, 9 people committed suicide today or whatever, but they don't say specifically, one of them had bipolar, one of them had schizophrenia, 2 of them had this. It should be encompassing the whole thing, I think, because they've done a lot of great work, as you said, becoming these brands and moving the discussion and needle. But I think it's time to move beyond that now to the pointy end, as you said, which is a really good point.
So where to from here then, Joel? I mean, I feel like it's spilled my guts out a little bit, but I think it's all for a good cause and also in some ways just to give a little bit of context about the kind of work that we do. Contrary to, I believe, Joel, I think there are some psychologists and psychiatrists and GPs out there who are really good people.
Yeah, no, look,
we really get it.
That's just my cynicism from my experience. Unfortunately, it sort of dogged me until now. Like, I didn't speak to a psychologist until I was probably 29.
Yeah.
Because I had a few issues going on in my personal life, and I sort of traced them back to I never really spoke about growing up with a parent with a mental illness and a lot of the stuff that went on with that. And I had to go through a couple before I found a decent one. And then because of the cost, I stopped as well.
Yeah.
So I think the cost as well is still very prohibitive to a lot of people because, you can't, with mine and your situations, you can't really ring up a hotline and talk to someone over the phone about it. You've got to really go to see someone in person and there's, see if you've got PTSD or talk about that sort of childhood trauma and try and get resolved.
Yeah, I agree with you. It does take time to find the right person. And the sad part you just mentioned, which another, we were talking about funding before, about the cost. Technically speaking, that's where some of the funding should go, is to alleviate some of the costs associated with an individual forking out money for some treatment.
Well, it's bloody expensive, man. Like I've got to go to a GP. I've then got to get on a mental health plan, even though I'm not really depressed or anxious, to get my Medicare rebate.
Yes.
Then I've got to go find someone. Now you can't book in for 3 to 6 months with anyone decent.
Yes.
And then you've got to go pay $150 or $180 sometimes out of your own pocket for each session. It's and you sort of like go, well, why should I go to all that trouble? I'm just going to deal with it myself, right? So that's that's a very real situation for a lot of people. Like for me and for me and a lot of people, let's say young kids or adults who grew up in these situations, we can't call a hotline really, can we? So we've got to get that proper treatment. And for us, depending on how you grew up, you might have an aversion to the field in general. So it might be very hard for you just to even do it. So there's a lot of things I think, as you said, the funding can go towards making, maybe if you grew up in that situation, you get priority access or something. I don't know, but
going back to the discussion we had earlier, because there are these little funding buckets that come in that do some of these things. So I do know in my experience that some primary health networks are able to alleviate some of this costs by doing specific funding towards things like that. But it is sporadic and sometimes not always sustainable. I tell the story that I had a wonderful person who helped me because she was someone with a lived experience. She became a consumer advocate. Her name is Alison Kakani, and she made a profound impact on me because she always lived a life with with mental illness. And what she explained to me is that even she was very serious about managing her mental illness. Because my mum, half the time she took it reasonably serious, half of the time she just neglected her condition. But this particular lady who I worked with said that she, from a very young age, particularly when she got married, because she got married very young, she said she really wanted to, she was aware of her mental illness, and two, she wanted to make sure she was on the front foot to manage it. And so this is go back. She passed away now. She was the most dear, wonderful person, but going back a number of years ago. And her idea was that she wanted to see a psychiatrist once a month, and that was just a ritual that she wanted to do. And you'd think that, and because she lived out in Western Sydney in very poor areas, that was really difficult. There were, the costs associated with the Medicare rebates and just getting someone consistently over in the same psychiatry. What she had to do is often she had to travel quite a long distance to go and see a psychiatrist. And when she had young kids and things started getting in the way, it was almost like enormous stretch for her just to maintain a monthly appointment, which she said she didn't do after her kids got 3 or 4 years old. She just couldn't do it. She said it was enormously expensive because psychiatrists, there's enormous shortage of psychiatrists in Western Sydney. Takes 6 to 8 weeks at the time she was telling me to get an appointment. And then she has to travel an hour or so to get to the appointment, make a booking, come back again. And so there are things that I think if we're smart enough with the government and in terms of how they direct the funding, those things could be better addressed. There is a reasonable amount of money in the system. It's a matter of also how to utilise it more efficiently. There is a bit of waste. We know this. Anyone who's in the sector would know that there's some money that goes to areas that potentially, it's not really beneficial for the consumer or person who needs help.
Oh, look, I can say it on your behalf. Governments waste money. They're happy to spend it, but is it spent efficiently like a business per se? Definitely not. So I'm happy to say that, and we know that happens. But I was going to say, well, then from that solution, do you think digital, or how does digital then play into it? Because in America, I listen to a lot of podcasts from America, and I'm hearing them promoting a lot of mental health and psychologists all via an app on the phone and all that sort of stuff. How do you see that developing over here, or do you think that will be a gap, or is there just no substitute for an in-person visit?
No, I think it'll be a complementary thing. To be honest with you, I think it's inevitable that kind of app and interaction will happen. Because I think what we'll do is it will enhance your, I suppose, connection with your professional. So, for example, if a client came and saw me once a month, we could interact with an app in between appointments. We can send homework, we can show videos, give some information to the family, be able to reduce some of the administrative things as well. That I can maybe send you a prescription via this app. I can send you some recommendations to see another professional through this app. I think, to be fair, I think that is the future of where we could create a lot of efficiencies is through that online kind of platform. You could do your own self-assessments and get some insights without necessarily sitting in a doctor's office and filling out a questionnaire. It's just a matter of coordinating in that. And the other thing which I think, and this is why I think it will take a long time to get this sort of technology up and running, is that people need to trust in this technology. And I think there is always an element of people not wanting to trust or still dubious about having very personal information on an online platform. The government is having, enormous investments in e-health and my medical records and things. And part of it is because people are still skeptical about the fact that there is an online platform. We heard about Optus just recently. Can you imagine if your medical records happen to be out in the dark web? But it will happen. We'll get better at it. Remember 10 years ago, I would never touch my phone to do banking, and eventually now I'm starting to see that I can have a little bit more assurances that if I do my banking online, it's really relatively safe. But I do think it's going to take a lot longer until these apps become part of your, I suppose, treatment or sort of, support. But it will happen. It will happen if it's a matter of if we get consensus and we get some alignment in terms of efficiencies and how systems come together, it's going to happen.
Because it's interesting. The one thing I think America does really well in regards to this. I don't know what you think about this, but in TV shows and stuff, even they talk about therapy like it's commonplace for everything, right? Yeah. Everyone, they always go, I've got to go see my therapy. It's growing up and seeing movies. It's like, well, it's a therapist and you know about it, but they just talk about it like it's so commonplace. And now they've got a massive, the Silicon Valley wants to get involved with making, who's going to be the startup that has revolutionized, online psychological care. And I just think that their culture towards getting regular therapy for their children or for young people, it just seems to be such a non-factor for them. Whereas over here, as you would know, with Australian culture, it just seems to be, it's a very still stigmatized or hard thing for people, for blokes especially, to go to a psychologist or to say, actually even say to someone they're going to see one.
It's funny you say that because I had this discussion with my kids not long ago. I think the next generation is much more open. We call it, there's a term that we call at home called openization. So it's the Oprah sort of element where people just discuss their things without any repercussions about how people might perceive it. So there is that tendency now where people are much more laxed about giving some personal information out to the world. But in America, you're right. There's a lot of therapy, a lot of discussions around therapy, and they debunked that element that it's okay now to see a therapist. That if you have an issue, that you share thoughts, which is not a bad thing. I guess the only question becomes is a therapy helping? Because I think one of the things that I think that as a professional, as a psychologist, one of the key things, it's not just a matter of getting therapy. It's if you're working with someone very close, you want to work yourself out of a job. You want to be able to that person get some real good skills and understanding and insights about their condition to be able to actually have a life away from therapy, so to speak. To be at a point where they call recovery, where they're able to actually start developing some thoughtful patterns of behavior and where essentially they become well or better. And that's a key, because I think there's a lot of promotion about you need to go and see a therapist. Okay, great. But as clinicians, we're here for a purpose, to try and help people move on past whatever that's the dilemma that they're going through, to work through it, understand it, and not to linger, to move on past that dilemma. I think one of the things, the discussion I had with my sons who are in their late teens, one of the things I do worry a little bit is that we're into this digital area now where everything has a digital footprint. So it's really hard to go past an experience where potentially if you did something 10 years ago and it's online, people can always go back and reflect and pull that out.
Yep.
Because part of therapy is that you want to progress past that event, past that experience, to actually grow from it and get some insights. So the new world, so to speak, this digital age, is going to create a lot of challenges for psychologists, psychiatrists to say, how do people move on so they don't get re-traumatized, or they compartmentalize that experience to be able to focus on a different part of their life. But yet there's an enormous digital footprint that's sitting there that could be always open up quite easily. There's a dilemma that I think we probably need to put into context. And the digital one is a two-edged sword, I think. One is it will create enormous efficiencies, get help much closer to when they need it, get some consistency and alignment of care. But the reciprocal side of it too is that, when can people leave that behind and move on to things in a different direction to what brought them to therapy in the first place?
That's a great point. Yeah, and the digital, this how social media is going to affect long term. We already know it's having a pretty negative effect with young girls, especially with Instagram.
Okay.
That's definitely proven. But it's definitely going to be an interesting one to see how it deals with in the thing. But as you said before about sharing the stories, I think with young people, hopefully that they can share more freely, because for one, once you share it and it's out there, you can't take it back for one, but you have power over it as well. Yes. You only share what you need to share. You don't have to share everything, but there's a certain power in once you can share it online, for example. Yep. You own it, and then what can someone say about it? Someone can be critical of you, but at the end of the day, if someone's critical of someone for being vulnerable, especially in an online environment, what does it say about the person being critical? So it's something where you have that power, and you can own your story now, and you can promote it and share online in the hope that it does help people to know that they're not alone. and then it can start shifting conversations towards some areas that you were passionate about.
But Joel, do you really control it? Because once it's out there, isn't it?
Oh, in regards to what you share. So you don't have to share every story, but in regards to, you control what you share. So for example, for me, I've taken the approach where I just share everything, because for me, it's therapeutic for me in a way, and I'm not ashamed about it. Like, what's someone going to say to me? Like, I've got a pretty successful career, and they're going to say, well, basically, if you know my story, I shouldn't have achieved what I've done. So you control what you share online. So if you don't want to share it, you just don't share it. But I think you can control and own that story as well, and understand that when you do put that out there, you're going to help someone, hopefully, and then also it's out there for the long term. I think it's only a positive thing, but that's how I sort of look at it.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. Yeah, there is some profound benefits to opening up these discussions and sharing it in a way that you think it's going to be, useful for other people to have.
Absolutely. Well, Bill, we've nearly gone for 2 hours, and thank you very much for your time.
Welcome.
I really do appreciate you sharing everything you've done. It takes a really brave and courageous person to share it, and I'm sure there'll be people listening who are nodding their head, going through, I went through that, or I can relate to that. I had similar things, and I know for a fact when I share these stories like this, I have people randomly on Instagram or Facebook or whatever message me in the DM saying that exactly. So thank you for taking the time. You're a busy CEO working in this area, so I really do appreciate your time and sharing your story and the lived experience, and I hope that more people can do so and be courageous and as you, and big thank you to yourself, and also your dad. What an amazing person to raise two amazing young people and to be there for your mum in what can be a very trying circumstance. There's obviously good times, as you said, but it can be a very difficult circumstance at times, and it takes a really special human being like your father to do that. So big thank you to yourself today, and thank you for sharing your story and the lived experience.
Thanks, Joel. All the best, and hopefully we'll touch base again in the future.
Yep, no worries.
Cheers. Bye.
Thanks, Bill.